Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Christina Cleveland, and I'm the Senior Director of Talent Development Solutions at Canadian Management Centre. We have a very full 60 minutes ahead, so we are going to get started. So just a quick overview of today's session. We are going to start off with a brief introduction of Canadian Management Centre, talk to you a little bit about a Twitter contest that we have going on live during the session today, and then we'll be transitioning over to Dr. Karen Sobel-Lejeski, who's joining us as our speaker today with the topic of employee engagement in the virtual workplace, what leaders need to know. So if this is your first time joining a CMC webinar, welcome. And for those of you who are regulars, welcome back. We're glad to have you. We did want to share a little background information on who Canadian Management Centre is and what it is that we do. So CMC is a national learning and training organization that is part of the AMA network with a presence in over 18 countries. We are proud to be part of one of the world's largest global knowledge networks. And our mission as an organization is to build inspired partnerships that prepare the next generation of leaders to thrive in tomorrow's marketplace. We strive to deliver webinars that are focused on the topics that are on the minds of Canadians and that are impacting our respective work environments, and are pleased to welcome over 1,100 people today from across the country to focus on the topic of employee engagement and the virtual workplace, what leaders need to know. We do have a Twitter contest that will be going live, so until 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time today, we will be running this contest. So if you tweet with insights from today's webinar using our hashtag CMC events, you will be entered for a chance to win a free copy of the book Leading the Virtual Workforce, which is co-authored by Dr. Lejeski. And you'll also win a one-year membership to the Virtual Distance Institute, which is a community of professionals who are facing the challenge of virtual distance in their respective organizations. A great discussion forum and hub of expertise that's offered through Virtual Distance International, which is Karen's organization. So again, tweet with insights today from the webinar using our hashtag CMC events. We have already been asked about receiving a copy of the PowerPoint slide deck from today's webinar, so please be advised that you will receive a follow-up email after today's session, which will provide you with a link to a recording of the session that you can access at a later date, or feel free to share with any colleagues. Now, before we get started, we did want to check in to also gauge your thoughts and opinion on the impact of distance in the workplace. So I would like to draw your attention to a poll that will be opening on the right-hand side of your screen, asking for your thoughts on the following question, which is, in your experience, do you think distance is a barrier to communication and collaboration? So go ahead and think about your respective workplace and submit your response. Again, the polling section is on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will close out the poll and get the results for the audience. So in terms of why this topic is important to us today, as I mentioned earlier, at CMC, we do try to bring forward relevant and meaningful webinars to provide insights on challenges that are impacting Canadians in their work environment. Employee engagement is a key focus area for us, given the direct impact that leaders can have on fostering a culture of engagement. And we've been asked by our clients about the impact a virtual work environment can have on the engagement level of employees. As you can see, in a study done by Gallup Consulting, 1 in 9 employees are emotionally connected to their workplace and feel that they have the resources they need to succeed. This particular study doesn't differentiate between employees who may be working within a corporate office and those who may be working virtually. However, based on their data, only 11% of workers worldwide are engaged. So when you layer in the complexity that can arise when working with individuals or teams who are in fact virtual, there are additional challenges that can come up. We know that the number of virtual and remote workers in Canada is on the rise. In fact, a recent Globe and Mail article indicated that the number of virtual workers has increased in the past 5 years by over 800%. And we also know that this has fostered an increased reliance on technology to communicate and collaborate. And really, we use technology to communicate and collaborate even when we may be working in the same office. So while these factors can make it challenging to foster a culture of engagement, when we're managing a virtual workforce in particular, not only do we need to focus on creating conditions that will engage employees, but we also have to actively monitor the signs and symptoms of disengagement, which can only be done effectively when we understand what contributes to workplace frustration for our employees, and not only just those who are in remote locations, because the feeling of distance can be created even when you may work down the hall from someone. So I do want to take a look at the results of our poll as we move into focusing on today's webinar. So it would appear that the majority of the audience does feel that distance can be a barrier to communicating and collaborating either often or occasionally. So only 6% of the audience feels that it always is a barrier, so that's encouraging. But we're going to look to see whether or not we can close that gap and reduce that to a rarely response. So the focus of today's webinar, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Karen Sobol-Lejeski back to CMC, and she's going to be reviewing some of the drivers of engagement, how the dynamics of a virtual work environment can factor in, and the benefits and disadvantages to virtual work on engagement. Now, Karen is also going to introduce us to the concept of virtual distance, which I have to say personally as a leader shifted my perspective on how to more effectively manage and lead my team. So Dr. Karen Sobol-Lejeski is the founder and chief executive officer of Virtual Distance International, which is an organization designed to help other organizations create meaningful workplaces where people can thrive in the digital age. She is also the co-author of 2 books, Leading the Virtual Workforce and Uniting the Virtual Workforce, which we'll highlight for you a little later in the session today. So Karen, without further ado, I'm going to transition it over to you.
I'm really delighted to be here. Thanks for having me back. I think it's a great topic and one that I am personally committed to myself. And I think on that note, I would like to tell you why I am engaged in this work, why I'm emotionally connected to this work, because I think it might help the audience out there to sort of understand where I'm coming from with my remarks. I think oftentimes we hear about ways to deal with the virtual workforce, but don't really understand the whole picture. So let me just share quickly with the audience why I got involved with this research and ultimately my work. I spent about 15 years on Wall Street, or in corporate America, many of those years on Wall Street. But my undergrad degrees are actually in computer science and applied mathematics. So I was kind of a techie. Well, I was a techie right out of college. I built computers. I built very complex computer programs. And I actually got out of that work a couple of years later because I couldn't stand sitting in front of a terminal all day, which is ironic that here I am in my office by myself at Stony Brook University talking to thousands of people without being able to see them. So anyway, just an irony of life, I think. But anyway, I moved out into the corporate world. I became a salesperson for technology companies. And then I eventually moved up into higher levels of strategic management positions, ultimately ending up as a vice president at Chase Manhattan Bank. I ran a practice for Mercer Consulting Group, became the chief operational officer and president of an e-business firm on Wall Street, and then ran North America for a foreign-based management and IT consultancy. And this was back in 2002, and I had been reading a lot and actually done reports on the e-business sort of movement. And what I thought was ironic was that as the technology, the communication technology was getting better and better and clearly giving us much more opportunities and ways to talk to each other online, I felt that people were actually not working together as well in teams as they had been before. And I felt that even though we had this great technology 10 years prior when I was working just with email and conference calls, I found that my teams were more connected than they were, let's say, 10 years later. And to me, this created a quandary, and I wanted to see if I was really seeing something true or whether I was, just overreacting to a situation in terms of being sort of overblown by technology. And what I ultimately discovered was that no, I wasn't. There was such a thing going on, and that thing ultimately was called virtual distance. So, all right, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what myths we've created, I think, around virtual work, and we need to shatter those myths before we can move on. We'll talk a little bit about what virtual distance is, especially as it relates to employee engagement, and what leaders really need to know about the truth of what's going on and how to relook at, reformulate a picture of the workforce. And then we'll summarize and take some questions. So let's begin by looking at some of the myths that we've created around virtual work. I think something that is just very underappreciated, although overly exaggerated in terms of it being a pundit's favorite thing to say, is that everything has changed. Clearly that's true, but I think what's most important about that is that it's changed while we were working. And we never really acknowledged the change. We just sort of said, well, things were changing. And the way that this comes out especially is when we look at companies and we ask them what's most important about the future. And in a recent study by IBM Human Capital Institute, they asked 400 executives from 40 countries around the world. And out of those, most people said that fostering collaboration was one of the #1 priorities for moving companies forward. But the problem is that only 8%, only 32 out of those 400 executives said that they could do that well or very well, which sort of goes along with the miserable engagement numbers that you pointed out at the beginning. So while we know what we need for success, engagement and collaboration, we're falling far short of achieving those. And there's a number of reasons why that's happening. So one of the trends, as you mentioned, the virtual workforce in Canada has increased by 800%. According to IDC in the U.S., 75% of the workforce will be virtual by the year 2013. And this is inclusive of and reflects an even bigger trend, which on a worldwide basis will show us over 1 billion, that's billion, B-I-L-L-I-O-N, people who are working virtually by the end of 2013, with the fastest growing segments of that population in Asia. And I think what's important to understand about being virtual, if you guys, the thousands of you who are on this call right now, if you were in front of me and I asked you what virtual work really looks like, you would tell me things like telecommuting, working from home, being at a client site, and things like this. But I contest, and I would ask you for the next 45 minutes or so to think about anyone who works on a laptop, a PDA, a smartphone, any kind of mobile device is indeed a virtual worker. Because if you think about what you're doing when you're looking at a screen, you're working virtually. Because if you ask yourself, well, who am I really talking to? Right, when I'm looking at that screen, most people say, well, if they think about it, I'm really just talking to the screen. I mean, yes, eventually my message goes out to someone, it's read, they respond, but the bottom line is I'm really talking to the screen all day long. And that people who do that are virtual. So with that, I think we wanted to take another poll, and as I move on, I would like you to think about in your organization, given that virtual workers are anyone who uses a mobile technology to get most of their work done. I'm curious to know what % of the workforce in your organization would you say are virtual workers. So as you answer that question, I want to move on to another dynamic. So you have this enormous increase in virtual workers, and you also have that butting up against major concern that's growing around the world about developing future leaders. So this same group at IBM who asked about the #1 priorities, including collaboration, also asked about what are some of the major concerns. And among them are companies who feel that their ability to develop future leaders is at high risk. And you can see that across the globe, these numbers are very high, with the highest being in Asia, but in North America, as you can see, also very high. So you have this flood or tremendous increase of virtual workers. You have global concern about building future leaders. And with that, we wanted to ask you another question, moving on, as this one times out, is considering leadership from a global perspective. Do you believe that trust and confidence in leadership has been declining, staying the same, or increasing? So as I look at your answers from the percentage of mobile workers, we'll put up the answers to this because I'm curious to know how you believe confidence in leadership is being affected as we move ahead. And as we can see, a lot of the results are mixed in terms of who's virtual. So clearly about 62% of you feel that over 50% of the workforce is virtual, and then a lower number thinks that it's a little less virtual. In terms of trust and confidence, when we look at the numbers coming out of the Harvard Kennedy School, we can see that overall in the United States, trust for our corporate leaders has been declining. In the 1950s, it was extremely high, over 80%. This was after World War II. Companies were seen to be doing good things for the community, building an industrial age, a golden age of sorts. Leaders were very involved in their local communities, and there was a high trust in and confidence in our corporate leaders. But in the 60s, this began to decline rapidly, and as of today, only 7%, according to Harvard's Kennedy School, have any trust at all in our corporate leaders. And this has fallen significantly, and now corporate leaders are below our politicians in terms of the level of trust that Americans have for them. So you have virtual workers on the rise. You have a concern about growing leadership issues. You have declining trust in leadership. And you also have a dynamic whereby if we look at how our management models and the rules of the game, if you will, that we've been taught on how to manage our workforce that were put together, many of them were put together for something called a vertically integrated enterprise. And many of you out there probably know what this means. But the net of it is that vertically integrated enterprises are companies that were set up that had, you know, the CEO at the top. The CEO only talked to his or her, well, it was mainly his, direct reports. The communication only flowed top to bottom, one way in one direction. Communication did not flow the other way. And this was set up by a guy named Frederick Winslow Taylor back in 1911 out of a work he called Scientific Management. But when you look at all the management models, the leadership models, the team models that were developed to manage this kind of organization, they were all developed really in the 50s and 60s. When the golden age of management was sort of here. And as I can see from your responses, clearly you also feel this pressure that trust in leadership is declining. And this ties back directly to the models we're trying to overlay in a world where we are no longer vertical. We have moved to horizontal networks of organizations. We have taken a lot of pieces of our companies and outsourced them. We have looked at our companies from a core competencies perspective and focused in on keeping core competencies intact but getting rid of everything else. So we've moved into these horizontal networks, but the unfortunate part is that we never updated our management models to directly address the issues that we were focused on in terms of trying to manage people who were no longer vertically connected, but horizontally connected. And worse, the management models that Stony Brook teaches, that Harvard teaches, that the London Business School teaches, are still those models from years ago. And we forgot one key element as we moved into this horizontal structure, and the key element we forgot, in my opinion, was the people. We forgot to account for how to manage people and how to get them engaged and emotionally connected and productive in this new world of work. So instead, we try to squeeze them into old models, and for that, we pay a very high price. And that price is something that I call the connectivity paradox. And what this paradox says, and I've seen over and over again, is that the more connected we become in terms of our ability to do amazing things, like have me talking to you guys in Canada thousands of miles away, the more isolated we can actually begin to feel. And I just will tell you that I'm living proof of that right now. I mean, I have to keep in my mind, very focused on the fact that there are thousands of you out there as I sit here in my office. And because I'm cognizant of that, I can hopefully effectively give you this talk. But you can imagine this is taking a lot of energy and brain power, and it's hard for people to do this on a daily basis, really focus. And the reason is because we have come to this technology so quickly, it's very difficult for us to absorb all of the unintended consequences. If you look at how long it took for major communication technologies to reach 50 million users or more, which is what this chart is showing. If you look at the phone, it took almost 75 years to reach 50 million people. The radio came next at 38 years. The television came next at 17 years. The PC came next at 11 years. But it took actually less than 3 years, for the internet to reach over 100 million people. And yet, if you look at when our management models were created, they were created at a time when our communication technology never could have supported the kind of communication that we use today. So to give you a quick example, if you take a team model, which many of you have been exposed to, in a normal team model, you look at a 4-phase process where a team is formed, then they storm, everybody sort of jockeys for position. People then, after a while, norm, they get to know where they belong on the team, and then they start performing. And through that process, actually, they're very engaged in a typical or traditional model. But when I ask audiences live, how many of you are on more than one team at a time these days, basically everyone's hands go up. The point being that if we think about the way we work on teams today, many of us are on multiple teams, teams that are temporary, teams made up of people who are virtually placed, not just in the office, and people who clearly work with mobile technology every day. So what ends up happening is, yeah, we form teams and all of these things happen, but they don't happen in a linear mode. They don't happen in a predictable mode. People form, then they perform, then they storm, then they norm in all different combinations. And so when I get calls from my clients or people curious about virtual distance who say they've spent millions of dollars or $1 million on team training and it's not working, they're befuddled. They can't figure out why. And I tell them it's because the basic assumptions that people are using to bring a standard traditional model into the virtual workforce no longer hold true. And the underlying assumption of all of these models is that our communications are mainly face-to-face, and we basically have compartmentalized ways of doing work. And those assumptions are no longer true, and they're fundamentally flawed, so we have to think of a way to go forward that makes more sense. Now, you take all of this and you layer that into what's going on with employee engagement. And often when I go to conferences or I ask people what employee engagement is, I get a number of different responses. So we can look to the research, if you will, to look at various ways that employee engagement is defined. And clearly, you know, in these particular references that I give you here, employee engagement is clearly connected to the emotional connection that people have with their work. If you look at other models, they break out engagement into engaged, well-engaged, and fully engaged. In my experience, what this translates into is something from a very individual focus, in other words, sort of your traditional job satisfaction. And then as you move up a continuum like this, you find that what's added to it in terms of being fully engaged is more of an organizational view and caring about the company along with individual factors. But as we can see from our trust question, if we don't trust our leaders in general, then we're going to have a really big problem getting fully engaged. So what our leaders have to do is not only win back trust, but they have to demonstrate that they actually get it, and they get the fact that things have changed, that they've lost their sort of cachet among employees, and to get people back fully engaged, they have to show them that they know that things are not only have gone awry, but can be fixed and bring confidence and leadership to that discussion. And that's what virtual distance is all about, which I'll get to in a minute. So when you look at the traditional employee engagement model, again, you'll see that the underlying assumptions are not built into these models. The employee in the middle of this picture is now a virtual worker in most cases. They're subject to the connectivity paradox because we keep trying to stuff them into these old models of what engagement really is. And as we move forward, we really need to take that into consideration. And just to top it off, this is some results from a study done, and they looked at, this was a Gallup study, and they looked at the daily commute time of people, and they broke it into less than 15 minutes, 15 to 30 minutes, et cetera. And then they looked at their mood as they defined it through engagement. And as you can see, it's regardless of how long their commute time is, in a way, very few people are actually engaged. So it's not that if you have a commute time of less than 15 minutes or you work from home versus a commute time of more than 45 minutes, you're more or less engaged. The numbers speak volumes about this. What's also troubling, as Christina mentioned in the beginning, is that a huge percentage, 15 to 27% of people, again, this trails a little bit their commute time, are actively disengaged. And what this actually means is that people who are actively disengaged with an organization can poison the organization. They can poison their groups. They can poison their teams. So it's not just that they're not engaged. It's that they can become sort of cancerous to the organization. And again, just to put an exclamation point on this, another company, Blessing & White, did a study very recently to show that only 31% of the global workforce that they looked at was engaged, with 13% being actively disengaged. So one of the things that I like to tell people is that, so we have all this evidence. We know all this stuff is going on. We need to shatter these myths that everything is fine. And we also have to understand that we can't come to the table to solve problems with using old models. And the quote I really love to introduce here is one from Albert Einstein, who said that no problem can be solved with the same consciousness that created it. So what that really means is we need a new paradigm. We need to step back and reimagine what our workforce looks like. And the way I did that was to really sit down and say, you know what? It's not technology that is at the center of our teams and groups. It is people who are at the center. And while that might sound small and trite, it is actually a very powerful thing, because when we reimagine people being at the center of a group or work team, we can better understand how to move forward. The reason why we need to do this is, and we need to have research to underscore what we understand, which is what virtual distance is based on, is because if we don't, the conflation, the mixing up of these ideas between what is technology more helpful or is people more helpful at the center continues. A lot of the research out there is too theoretical, it's too soft, it's based on things people can't measure, and we need better data. We need it because every time we open the papers, they're telling us something else. 1 minute they're saying companies are rethinking telecommuting trends, and literally the next week the same writer comes out and tells us that managers are learning to bond with remote employees. And if we think this is limited to our corporations, we have to think again. So I don't know about how this is happening in Canada, but I speak all over the world, and I just like to mention the fact that the same trends that started us off on this path in corporate America are finding their way into our education systems. So, for example, Steve Lohr of New York Times, the technology writer, in 2009 came out with a front page story that said, study finds that online education beats the classroom. And he referenced a study done by the Stanford Research Institute, an organization highly respected by me and others, but whose clients include those companies who make money from selling technology. So we have to think about where the source of information comes from. But the next year, almost to the day, he puts out another headline that says, second thoughts on online education, where he references information from the National Bureau of Economic Research to show that actually online education is hurting our children, especially minorities and younger kids. I say this to you because as a work audience, we need to not only be cognizant and fix the issues or the gaps that we're looking at in our organizations, but we have to be very wary about what's happening in our education systems. But for more on that, please feel free to get in touch with me. I'm currently working with a PhD student who's looking at that particular impact right now. Okay, so we step back, we take a look, what is virtual distance and why do we need to understand it? So in order to do that, I'm going to give you just a little thought experiment, and this thought experiment involves two scenarios. It's an ethical dilemma that you're not expected to solve, but I want you to start thinking about the notion of distance. So in the first part of the dilemma, you are a train operator operating a train in a huge control room. And you know that you have to switch that train from one track to, you have to switch one of the trains from one track to another. And you know that if you switch it to the first track, there's one man working on the train track, and he will be killed if you switch it to that train track. But you also know that 5 men are working on your other choice, and if you switch it to that second track, you will kill 5 people. Now, the question here is, what track do you switch that train to? And you don't have the option of not switching the train or anything else. You have to switch the train to one or the other. And in most cases, people will say that in this scenario, they will switch the track to where there's only one person working, because you would sacrifice one to save the 5. The second piece of that scenario is, it's the same thing, but different setting. The setting is that you're standing on a bridge, and underneath you is a train track. And you know a train is coming from behind you, and it's going very fast. And you also know that there are 5 people downstream on that track who will be killed if that train is not slowed down. And then you see a man, a very big person, standing on top of the bridge, and you know that if you shove this person, if you physically push them off the bridge, they will fall to their death, but they're so big that when the train hits them, they will slow it down enough to release and let those 5 people escape. Now, you may think this is a morbid example, and of course, this is just an ethical dilemma developed at Princeton University. And most people in this situation will say that they will not push the person off the bridge. They will let the other 5 people die because they can't bring themselves to actually push the person off the bridge. What's happening here is that in the first scenario, we are using a very logical part of our brain, rational part of our brain, that says, no, I will sacrifice 1 to save 5 because it makes sense. In the second scenario, we're lighting up the emotional side of our brain, the side of our brain that is most likely to motivate us into action, the part of our brain that keeps us engaged in our life, engaged in our work. And with that in place, we cannot bring ourselves, a normal person cannot bring themselves to kill another human being. So they will make the opposite choice. So when people tell you that distance doesn't matter, we can talk to anybody, that's true in a sense of we can technically talk to them, but distance does matter in terms of the way we behave towards one another. It changes our decision-making process. But the fact of the matter is that most of us are working virtually, so it's actually the perceptual distance between us that matters even more. So when I say this, I refer you to a study that was done by some other researchers who took a group of people and put them into a room one at a time with just video conferencing and instant messaging. And what they did was they asked the person to solve a problem with the person who was on the other end of this technological connection. The only difference between 2 scenarios was that the first group was told that they were in the same neighborhood area, and the second group was told that the person they were talking to was 5,000 miles away or across the other side of the country. And what they found in this study was that the people who just thought that they were further away tended to cooperate with each other less, tended to persuade each other less, and tended to deceive each other more. So it's an unconscious mechanism that we have, that when we think that people are further away or we perceive them to be further away, which we always do when we're staring at a screen, then our behavior changes. So how can we fix that? Well, we can understand what virtual distance is. So virtual distance is a perceived distance. It begins to grow as we rely heavily on electronic communications. We can calculate virtual distance. I can calculate it using the virtual distance index. And it's so strong that I can actually predict when it's going to happen. And we've seen some unexpected results. And those results include the fact that we can see just as high levels of virtual distance between people who are sitting right next to each other as we do between people who are thousands of miles apart. And the opposite is true. We see very low levels of virtual distance between people who are thousands of miles away when they're connected to each other on certain levels of value alignment and things I'll talk about in a minute. But it's not just that we have virtual distance, it's that it has a consequence. It has many consequences that we as leaders need to care about. So when virtual distance is relatively high, and this data comes now from over 800 cases of project teams or groups that work virtually from all over the world. When virtual distance is relatively high, trust declines significantly, innovation drops by over 90%, meaning that when we just perceive that we're far away, we don't tend to take risks with one another, we don't tend to share ideas, we don't bring learning forward from one project to the next. Our organizational citizenship behavior declines significantly, meaning that all those things that make us more fully engaged, that have to do with being emotionally connected not just to our job satisfaction and our job itself and the narrow group around us, but to the bigger company and the bigger organization at large, goes way down. We don't feel like we are citizens of any corporation per se. We feel like isolates among isolates. So all of these effects drag down our bottom line, it drags down our job satisfaction, it drags down our trust in one another, etc. So if we reduce virtual distance, we can improve all of these measures, is the net of this story. But what's important to learn about this story for you out there listening is that the significant impact does not come from physical distance. So we're constantly chasing after the idea that if only we could just figure out how to fix this physical distance issue, we'd get much better performance. We wouldn't have all these problems. But that's not true, because the main impact is coming from something I call operational distance and another piece that I call affinity distance, which I'll talk to you about for a couple of minutes, and then we'll conclude. So with that in mind, we wanted to know, do you work or manage a group that is co-located in terms of being in the same location, virtual, or hybrid? So we'll look at that in a minute. So if you look at the model, the virtual distance model, it includes three pieces. It's physical distance, because you can't ignore physical distance, but as you'll see at the end, there are just basically 5 times when you really need to be face-to-face, and you can be face-to-face actually too often in today's world. So communication technology actually helps us be more productive at certain times. Operational distance and affinity distance are the other two that I really want to focus in on. So physical distance, I'll just say quickly, is just the usual suspects. It's geography, time zone differences, and the extent to which we're affiliated with the same company. So in other words, if I'm with company A and you're with company B, there's some there's some organizational distance. If I'm with the marketing department and you're with the manufacturing department in the same organization, then we also have some organizational distance. But the two main culprits are operational distance and affinity distance. And operational distance really comes from two main suspects, if you will. And the first is something called communications distance. So I like this cartoon because I think everybody can relate to it. It's two parents sitting down with their kid for a meal, and they say to him, yes, well, we could read your blog, or you could just tell us about your school day. So I think in every home in the country, including my own, sometimes we find virtual distance and a lack of good communication in our own household. Well, why is that? One of the reasons is because we don't have the requisite context that we need in order to understand what other people are saying. So what do I mean by that? I always like to tell a story about an admiral who I was interviewing who used to command a huge fleet of naval carriers. And when I was asking him about how he felt about virtual communications, email, webinars, etc., he told me a story. And the story was, he said, Karen, he said, the darkest place on the face of the earth is in the middle of the night on the ocean during a new moon, meaning there's no moon in the sky. And he said, you cannot see your hand in front of your face. And he said, I will not send a rookie pilot to land the plane onto the carrier deck under those conditions. And when I ask my audience why, they usually say, and as I'm sure you would, that it's because he doesn't have enough experience, he is too new to the job, etc. And all of those things are true. But what the Admiral said to me is, Karen, he said, he has his instruments, but he has not developed a sense of depth perception. He can't really know. He doesn't sense. He doesn't feel. He's not engaged with how high up he is or how low he is or the tilt of his plane. He said, and that's how I feel when I'm talking to people over email. I have no depth perception, meaning we lose the context in which people are living their lives or doing their work. People have certain feelings about the world that we would normally see in a traditional workplace, and we would unconsciously but automatically consider those things as we consider what they're saying to us. But in a virtual space, this context, it doesn't go away, it just disappears. It leaves us from out of sight, and it becomes invisible. And at the same time, we carry with us something called same as me bias, which really just means that we look at the world initially through our own lenses. It's an evolutionary thing that's happened to us over the course of many eons. But when I sit down to talk to a person, I'm coming to that conversation assuming that person is just like me. But what ends up happening is after a couple of seconds, I realize this person is not just like me. They're different in many ways. They look different. They talk differently. They talk more faster. They're a different color than I am. They grew up in a different town than I did, etc. And in that few seconds, unconsciously, I'm adapting to how that person is different. And they're doing the same thing. And in that moment, we create a civil conversation. As I told the World Economic Forum last week, we create civil societies by adjusting to the way we think about things, by understanding the context in which we look at things. But when our context disappears and becomes invisible, misunderstandings are easy things, are things that happen all the time. They happen all the time because when we read an email, we see it through our own lens. We don't necessarily know what the other person had in mind at all, right? So I often tell the story, how many of you have gotten emails that made you mad? And I'm sure many of you have. How many of you have read those emails more than once, more than twice, taken them home and seen things you couldn't believe you didn't see the first time? In those cases, you will carry a conflicting idea and an angry idea of who that other person is. And it's difficult to resolve because that's the only thing the relationship is built on. And here's the problem. In order to get to shared meaning in communications theory, I didn't invent this, you need to start with a shared context. If you don't have a shared context, then you've got a problem. But if you have a shared context, then you exchange information, and that's how you get to shared meaning. And then we can move on and solve big problems and deal with each other in a civil way. But when we cut off shared context, which is what we do all the time when we're talking virtually, and it's unconscious, We can't get to shared meaning because you can't leapfrog from information exchange to shared meaning. So to resolve virtual distance issues is really all about restoring shared context. So if you walk away with nothing else from this session, understand that as a leader, the people who work for you and are trying to get work done don't really have a full perceptual understanding of other people. And it's your job, I contest, to help restore that context in a variety of ways. One way, and the other issue around communications distance, is knowing when and where to use what type of communication mode. So communications distance increases not only because we have a lack of shared context, but also because we tend to overuse one mode of communication over another. This could be, as I said, too much of an emphasis on face-to-face or too much of an emphasis on, let's say, email. But what's important to understand is that email serves a good purpose as a communication mode when we're trying to edit information, like in a report, and then share that and modify the report so that we get it ready for whatever we need it for. Or when we want to fine-tune a message. Email and other types of asynchronous communications work really well. Face-to-face, video, phone works really well when we need feedback, when we need people to give us signals about how they feel about what we're saying to them. So communications distance is really about mixing and matching modes appropriately. The other big part of operational distance is about multitasking and multi-load. And when it comes to multitasking and multi-load, what you need to understand is that we've actually found that multitasking and being on multiple projects can actually help people to learn more and come up with more creative ideas and solutions if virtual distance is low on every other factor. So this makes sense, right? If you're working on more than one project and you're communicating well with other people and you're doing more things, what you ultimately end up doing is you bring that learning forward into other things. Of course, that also reaches a point of diminishing returns and you can't be overloaded. However, if virtual distance is high on everything else and communications are not going well, what we find is that if you're tasking too much or you're working on too many projects, you get zero benefit out of that. As a matter of fact, you get an increasingly negative benefit to outcomes like innovation right away. So just based on that, I'm curious to know how many of you think that operational distance is something you're experiencing in your team or your organization. And just in closing on the model, affinity distance is the last piece. And affinity distance has to do with the extent to which we really develop a sense of close relationships with one another in the long term. Cultural distance is not necessarily about demographics. Okay, it's not necessarily about I'm from India, you're from the US, I'm from Canada, you're from China, therefore we have cultural distance. That's part of it. But cultural distance really has to do more with how our value systems align. And the reason I say that is because we use things like Hofstede's model a lot to train ourselves on how to understand other cultures, demographic cultures. But that's not everything that's going on. And when all we have is that, so I say the expression, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you think about cultural distance as just being demographic differences, instead of the way people feel about the way they work, and is the way they feel aligned with other people in terms of the way they feel, then we are doing ourselves a disservice. So what we really need to think about are what people care about, and as leaders, make that context available to everyone else so that people can start to understand whether or not their values are aligned with other people's on the team. And when they start to realize that they are, usually, virtual distance goes down. The second part of affinity is about what status do you hold. If you lean on a formal status in terms of why you're respected or why people like you, versus an informal status, which is about what you contribute to the work, then virtual distance goes up. The next piece is around relationship distance, which has to do with whether or not you knew people before you worked together or you know some of the same people in your social network. It's important that we have strong ties to each other, but it's actually more important for reducing virtual distance to have weak ties, meaning that we may come to the table not knowing each other, but if we know some of the same people in common, we will trust each other much more quickly. So leaders can actually seed teams where people may not know each other from before, but they have some of the same social network in common. And the last piece of affinity is around interdependence distance. And what this means is, do people really feel a sense of shared future and fate? And if they don't, and if people feel like the consequences of the work and the results of the work are not fully shared among all the team members, then people are not interdependent, and that raises virtual distance very high. So as I can see from the poll, a lot of you experience operational distance. I'm just going to end this session now by running you through some of the metrics and solution roadmaps, and then take some questions and answers. So the way we look at virtual distance is through the Virtual Distance Index. What you see here is a virtual distance profile. It's very heavily weighted towards the pieces of affinity distance that I just talked about. This is a case study that looks at a government situation, very different than the pharma situation I just showed you here. So in this government situation, social distance is clearly a problem, meaning formal status gets in the way of people really feeling close to each other. But cultural distance here is also a problem. And in this example, you see another picture of a large financial services company that I call BigCorp. It has yet another shape. And when we look at it against the benchmark data we have in financial services, comparatively speaking, it's also a little bit different. The reason why these are important is because it's important to understand that different companies suffer from virtual distance in different ways. And that's important to know and measure up front so you don't start chasing after solutions that make no sense for your company. You want to target and focus your solution. So as I just run through this real quick, in terms of BigCorp, this is what their virtual distance impact analysis looked like. So as opposed to trust and innovation coming up first in our benchmark data, for this particular company, the biggest impact virtual distance was having was on clarity, meaning people didn't understand what their roles and goals were. And learning was a big problem. In other words, they weren't passing along learning from one project to another. And innovation came in a close third. And as you can see, affinity distance was the main culprit. So they were trying to put solutions together to reduce geographic distance, but it was the affinity pieces, the cultural distance, the interdependence distance, et cetera, that was causing them the most problems. So at the end of the day, what we ultimately did was develop a plan that focused on reducing affinity distance. So I'm actually just going to skip, and just quickly, I'll show you because I'm running out of time. These were questions that they had with regard to engagement. So this particular client I was working with to improve employee engagement, among other things. And as you can see, it was affinity distance that was impacting in a negative way the most important pieces of engagement that they were looking at. And the questions on the right just represent questions in their own survey on engagement that we used to compare against virtual distance. So flipping ahead, I'm going to flip the piece on mapping. I can just tell you that virtual distance mapping is one way to get from a macro view to a micro view. So you really have to look at and understand where virtual distance lives in order to take action to mitigate it. And you do that by identifying the key players, locating where the most critical relationships are, and then once you've identified those, you take action to reduce virtual distance. So how do you solve? So once you've done all this and you say, okay, I got it, now what do I do to fix it, Karen? You use what I call the virtual distance solution roadmap. And we don't have time to go into this in detail, but I can tell you that when you're talking about geographic distance, Well, let me back up. The first thing you want to do is become aware that virtual distance exists. This can actually solve many problems. The second thing you want to do is develop what I call TechnoDexterity, which means using the right communication, message, and mode given any particular situation. And you use the communication chart that I showed you before to try to start to discern when and where to use the right message. And beyond sort of the face-to-face issues, in terms of operational distance and communications distance, which is the major culprit in that piece, you want to try to rebalance your communication. So mix up the mode and method, but most importantly, create context. Help people understand what other people are doing, how it fits into their work, how it fits into your work, how you share responsibility. And you do this either by injecting specific pieces of contextual information into your conversations, like so-and-so works in South America. In South America, it's very hot, and their office looks like this, and you show them pictures of where they work. Or you talk more indirectly but precisely about how other people's work is feeding into your success. So you pick a success story and you talk about how all the people on the team worked to get to that success. And as far as affinity goes, you really have to use strategies that help to layer different cultural values, not replace them. It doesn't work. Recognize people for what they contribute. Seed teams with people who have existing relationships, and help people discover how they're connected and interdependent on one another.
Thanks so much, Karen. I know that that's bringing us to the end of the session and the top of the hour, but we do want to just address one of the questions that we received from participants, which was how to get more information about operational, physical, and affinity distance. And so I just want to draw everyone's attention to Karen's books, Uniting the Virtual Workforce and Leading the Virtual Workforce. We did receive a question about whether or not these books are relevant for employees and not just leaders. And I would say absolutely. Uniting the Virtual Workforce reviews in depth the concepts related to virtual distance, and then Leading the Virtual Workforce puts that even more so into a leadership context. Right, Karen?
Yeah, absolutely. It's good for individuals because they can help themselves understand how they may be able to take better charge of their life and their situation at work. And yeah, I think that's right on the money.
Perfect. So these books are available at Chapters and Amazon and, of course, local business bookstores. But, Karen, I do want to thank you so much. You definitely piqued interest within an hour. I know that it's not a lot of time to cover such a big and broad topic, but we appreciate your insights as it relates to connecting the virtual work environment to employee engagement. So for our participants on the line, this does bring us to the end of the session. So you will receive an opportunity to complete a survey, and we do ask for your suggestions, feedback, comments, and any other ideas that you may have about topics that you'd like to see covered within our webinars. So we welcome your feedback. And we do also want to notify you about our next upcoming webinar, which is on Wednesday, August 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. The title is Upgrade Your Leadership Now, 9 Advanced Skills. So we'll be welcoming Giselle Kovari from NGen People Performance, who will be talking about the skills that are required for leaders to engage today's multi-generational workforce. So we'll look forward to seeing you back then. For any additional tools, resources, and of course information about courses that we have available, you can visit us at www.cmcoutperform.com. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll look forward to welcoming you back in the future.